O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
The 10, now let's get into our 30 arguments here. So the first 10 that I wrote down are the most significant arguments for the existence of God. Now, these arguments are not specifically for Christianity per se. Obviously, any Christian should use these arguments because these are just proving. So typically, the debate partner here would be an atheist or a secularist or something of that sort, maybe agnostic. But what the point here is trying to prove the logical validity and veracity that there must be a eternal creator. And that's what these arguments are generally doing. So we have the tag. That's going to be number one. Obviously, it's my most favorite. I think it's the most compelling. But as I said, it also has some shortcomings. So we'll be looking at the transcendental argument for God, the cosmological argument, or what's often referred to as the argument from contingency. We'll explain all that here in a few. And remind you, when I put these classical sources or modern representation, it's not all orthodox, right? I was just trying to find examples of these arguments being used in history. So this is not me trying to say, Kant or Leibniz are orthodox voices in history. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just showing you where some of these arguments come from. And so first one is the argument from contingency, the cosmological argument. Then you got William Lane Craig's favorite argument, the kalam argument, which comes from Al-Ghazali, Islamic. It's an Islamic argument in the beginning, but it has to do with temporal causation. So we'll get into the kalam argument, teleological fine-tuning argument, the moral argument, the ontological argument, the argument from consciousness, and then the beauty. I do have an aesthetic one. So, and then the beauty, desire, and then religious experience. Those are the 10 arguments that we're going to move through here in regards to the most significant arguments for the existence of God. Then we'll get into arguments against non-Christian traditions. So number one, the transcendental argument for God, tag, as it's most commonly referred to. As you guys are probably aware, this is an argument that really begins with Cornelius Van Til and Greg Bahnsen, who kind of made it popular. But this is kind of the go-to for myself, Dyer, Father Deacon Dr. Ananias. But it also has some shortcomings because a lot of people can't follow the argument. So what is the tag argument? Well, I have a video on this YouTube channel that goes, it's kind of a slideshow. It's actually one of the earlier videos I ever made. It's very popular, which tries to break down and explain what the tag argument is trying to do. So the core claim is that logic, morality, and rationality themselves, and you can go on, basically all the transcendental categories. You could include meaning, language, these types of things, truth, themselves presuppose the existence of the Christian God as their precondition. So what you're doing is you're making the argument that all these non-physical things actually presuppose the existence of the Christian God. And so the structure is logical absolutes, moral norms, and the uniformity of nature exist. These cannot be grounded in materialism or relativism. Why can you not ground them in materialism? Because you're talking about non-physical things. How can the laws of logic or language or mathematics, number theory, how are these rooted in materialism? Because by definition, from the materialist argument, all material is constantly changing. Heraclitus says you never step in the same river twice. That's what he's talking about, the constant flux of the material world. So if the material world is constantly changing, how are there non-physical things that are unchanging? That doesn't make any sense. Therefore, there must be a transcendent source, which these universals are rooted in, these transcendental, philosophical transcendentals, if you want to use a Kantian approach. They must be rooted in something. For Kant, it was the human mind. For us as Orthodox Christians, we begin with revelation. They begin with the mind of God, actually. And so these cannot be grounded in materialism or relativism because you're making truth claims. Therefore, they presuppose a transcendent, rational, moral, and personal source, i.e. God. And so, as I said, it's rooted in presuppositional apologetics, and it builds upon Kant's transcendental method, asking what must be true for experience and reasoning to be possible. And so it's false to say that, the tag argument is just like a Kantian argument. No. You can highlight that in Aristotle, metaphysics, he talks about the sophist and highlights the use of non-contradiction, that for there to be no true thing and then you claim something to be true, that contradicts then the claim that you're making. And so the sophistry itself is a contradictory concept, and therefore it violates the law of non-contradiction. And so it's a kind of a presupposing of somebody. It's really just taking this presuppositional approach. Yes, Kant talked about the philosophical transcendentals. He took Aristotle's 10 metaphysical categories and created the 12 transcendental categories for himself, the a priori categories. So that is kind of the structure of the argument, but it's not just a Kantian argument. That's a total misnomer. And so the strength is that it moves beyond probability to necessity and unites epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. The objections, critics argue that it assumes Christian theism at the outset, which is true, right? You'll get an objection of somebody saying, yeah, but you're just presupposing God. Yes, because you're just presupposing all these categories that you can't justify. The point has to do with the concepts of truth. There's correspondence theory. The fact that I'm wearing a blue jacket corresponds to observable reality. Therefore, I must be wearing a blue jacket. That is a true statement. But then there's coherency theory. And when we're dealing with worldviews and paradigms, this is kind of the move of the early 20th century. This is what undercut logical positivism, is that we're actually assuming a lot of things. And so can your worldview account for the things that it assumes? The argument and the move being made here with Tag is that, yeah, if I assume God and I assume that things are revealed, then everything can kind of fall into place. And it's a more coherent worldview than an atheistic worldview. And then some question whether logic requires a personal being. This has to do with our theological presupposition of our own. Next argument for the existence of God is the cosmological argument, the argument from contingency. And so everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in necessity or contingency. The universe is contingent, therefore it requires a necessary being. So what are we talking about? Contingency means that it could or could not exist, right? So the idea here is that the universe itself could exist or it could not exist. You could exist or could not exist. And that is a logical, that is a logically sound statement. If then everything that's contingent could exist or not exist, the fact that it does exist means it must depend upon a non-contingent entity or baseline, something that is non-contingent, something that must exist and can never not exist. That's the structure of the argument here. So every contingent being has a reason for its existence. The universe is contingent, meaning it could exist or not exist. Therefore, the universe has an explanation in a necessary being outside itself. That's the only way that it could exist. And so philosophical background, it's similar to the unmoved mover argument of Aristotle, Aquinas' second and third ways, Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. The strength of this argument is that it's rationally rigorous and metaphysically grounded. You can't provide an example of something that could exist or not exist that doesn't depend on something existing. And it's compatible with modern cosmology. Now, I'm not in favor of the Big Bang or the finitude of time regarding the cosmological perspective, but this argument already deals with that, because according to secular science, they're saying that the Big Bang, is the foundation of the universe. But if that's the case, there must then be a point in which the Big Bang didn't occur. Therefore, the Big Bang itself is a contingent phenomenon, you see. And that's what makes this argument strong, is that you can play with modern cosmology and still make this argument, right? And that's where you'll see modern secularists, they'll just say, yeah, but we live in a multiverse, so then it's just infinite regression, right? Which gets back to the unmoved mover point, is that no, you just move to a multiverse theory, but you just move to you still have to have the unmoved mover. You just have infinite regress going on here. So that's one of the strengths. The objections is quantum physics, quantum cosmology may deny contingency. I've seen some people make this argument, and then critics dispute the principle of sufficient reason. So, okay, depending on what school they're coming from, a school of thought, they may have take some umbrage with the frame of the argument, but it's still rationally rigorous and metaphysically grounded. So that is the argument, the cosmological argument from contingency. The next argument, number 3, in arguments for the existence of God, is the kalam cosmological argument, temporal causation. And so what is the core claim? This is the favorite argument from William Lane Craig, is that the universe began to exist, therefore it must have a cause. Now, immediately you're thinking, well, that sounds a lot like the argument from contingency. Well, not exist exactly. This is a temporal causational argument. It's very similar. This one is an ontological argument. It's talking about existence itself, the cosmological argument. The kalam argument is really talking about temporal causation. And so whatever begins to exist has a cause. This is the first premise. The universe began to exist. Anybody would agree with that. Therefore, the universe has a cause, which must be timeless, spaceless, or immaterial. So it's very similar structure to the argument from contingency, but a little bit of a different focus. So this is the kalam cosmological, and it originates from the Islamic kalam theology, al-Ghazali, and revived by modern analytic theists. So it's supported by Big Bang cosmology and thermodynamics, and appeals to intuitive causal reasoning. Again, quantum events objections. If somebody's really into quantum physics, they may object to that, or that causality may not apply beyond space and time, which could be a fair critique. But you'll see, once we move beyond tag here, all these other ones these are not presuppositional in the same sense of accounting for one's worldview. Most of these arguments you can go back and forth with an atheist because you're both playing upon foundationalism, right? That there's these unspoken foundations of knowledge and understanding that we don't need to justify. They're just there, which would be fine if we're all Christian, but we're not all Christian. And so that's why the tag argument is important, is to get these secularists and atheists to try to justify their foundationalism, which they can't do in their own worldview. So that's what, so the arguments moving forward are much more foundationalist arguments than the precept approach. Number 4, the teleological fine-tuning argument. I'm sure most people have heard this. And I think this is actually, again, is it the strongest philosophical argument? I'd say no, but I do think it's a very strong argument for the average person, because when we talked about apologetics, you have to realize who you're talking to. Right. If you're maybe all the apologetic arguments, but when you encounter Sally on the street corner, you start breaking down Kant's philosophical categories. It's kind of demonstrating your inability to be an effective apologist. Right. You have to know who you're speaking to. And so the teleological fine-tuning argument, I think, is one that a lot of people can wrap their mind around. And so the core claim is the physical constants and laws of the universe are finely tuned for life. This is best explained by intelligent design rather than chance, right? And even modern cosmology, so they used to say the universe was 13.8 billion years old. Did you guys, I've mentioned in previous streams, they've upped that number. I think it's now like they have it like 28 billion, or I forget what it is. But anyways, the reason why they upped the age of the universe is because, based on probability and statistical analysis alone, if everything is just a random happening and a random mutation, there wasn't excuse me there wasn't even enough time in their own cosmological story to account for total random mutation to occur. And so this sort of undermines this idea where science is constantly trying to recount its story to make it like plausibly successful. But the time frame, random mutation, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't work mathematically. Even if you were a total skeptic, and the Hoover Institute has a great video on debunking like evolution and talking a little bit about these things. And these are, I think 2 of them were Jewish. One was Christian, but anyways, it was a good video. I did a stream covering it one time. So it has to do with life exists. Therefore, the universe is so finely tuned for life to exist. It best explained by an intelligent designer than random chance and happening, which modern evolutionary cosmology would argue. The structure of the argument is the universe's physical constraints are finely tuned for life. Fine-tuning is not plausibly due to chance or necessity. Therefore, a designer God is the best explanation. And so, sort of an argument to the conclusion of the contrary. So, because everything is so perfectly tuned, there can't just be a random happening. There must be then a designer God. And so classical teleology, you find it in Aristotle and Aquinas, modern cosmological fine-tuning, or the anthropic principle. You may have heard it referred to as that before. So the strengths, it's supported by contemporary physics and probability theory. It's easy to communicate intuitively. Objections is multiverse hypothesis, which I said really isn't an out for anybody who's going to appeal to the multiverse. Why is it not an out? Because it's just infinite regress. And as we've already showed with the argument from contingency and even the kalam cosmological, is there has to be an endpoint. Aristotle already figured out the unmoved mover. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the multiverse theory world haven't. So that's that could be an objection used, or who designed the designer, right? Richard Dawkins. But that's a category error, right? I'm kind of blown away by how often I hear people say, well, if God created the universe, then who created God? What? Again, unmoved mover. Like, this is we figured this stuff out 2,500 years ago. Like, what are you talking about? It's a category error. Just because we're talking about a transcendent eternal creator doesn't mean that the eternal creator needs to be created, because by definition, it's a category error. He is eternal. He is uncreated by definition. So it's a definitional category error for somebody to say, oh yeah, well then who created God? What? You idiot. No. So the objections to this argument are pretty weak. From a naturalist standpoint. The moral argument, core claim, moral objective values and duties exist and are best explained by God. Structure is, if God does not exist, moral objective values do not exist. And you can also flip this in the affirmative, right? So you could say there is a universal moral law, or if there is a moral universal law. So I did it in the negative just to flip it. But if God does not exist, moral objective values do not exist. Moral objective values do exist. Therefore, God exists. That's kind of the basic structure of the argument. And you can get into like the lawgiver. So I've heard this reframed as the argument for morality. You could say that every law has a lawgiver. There is a universal moral law. Therefore, there must be a universal moral lawgiver, i.e. God. So that's another way to frame the same argument. It's grounded in natural law and moral realism. Its strength, it speaks to universal human experience and conscience. It bridges moral experience with metaphysical grounding. Objections, moral realism without God, Platonism, humanism, cultural relativism arguments. But again, if anybody makes a relativistic argument, they're already in trouble because they're going to be self-contradictory. So next one, number 6, for arguments for the existence of God, the ontological argument. So core claim, the very concept of God as the greatest conceivable being implies his existence. So this is Anselm's argument. It's not my favorite argument. I'll be honest with that. It's not my favorite argument, but it is a popular argument that some people use. And so the structure is this. I use Anselm's classical form. God is the greatest conceivable being, right? God is the greatest thing that you can conceptually create. A being that exists in reality is greater than one existing only in thought, right? The actualization is greater than the abstraction. Therefore, God must exist in reality. And so St. Anselm of Canterbury, further developed by Descartes, Leibniz, and modern modal logic. Strength, it's a purely a priori argument, no dependence on empirical evidence. And in modern modal form, it's logically robust. However, the objections would be that existence is not a predicate, i.e. Kant, and the concept may not entail reality. And I would say that's probably the stronger approach, that again, I'm in favor of the argument for the existence of God. But if I were to take the devil's advocate side, I would probably use that a concept may not entail reality. I think that's the strongest counter argument to the ontological argument of Anselm is you can just then your opponent could just play off the fact that, okay, but a lot of people conceptually create things that don't exist in reality. Why couldn't God be the same thing? For Anselm, he was existing at a time in which everybody already assumed that God exists, right? So I think the cultural context also changes the viability of this argument. So if I was to refute somebody using it, I would say just because one has a concept of something doesn't mean it entails a reality of it. I mean, a la men can become women, right? But overall, I'm in favor of the argument. This is the ontological argument famous from Anselm of Canterbury. Number 7, the argument from consciousness. Now, I think this is actually a strong argument, and you don't hear it as often. I actually used it in my book, Return to Babylon from Adam to Antichrist, concerning the philosophy of mind and qualia, which we're going to get into, qualia. So this has to do with the hard problem of the philosophy of mind is actually giving an account for consciousness. And so the argument goes, human consciousness cannot be explained by physical processes alone and implies a transcendent mind. Now, most philosophy of mind or most neurosciences are probably in the emergentist group. They believe that mind emerges due to neural processes of complexity. And then you get like identity theory, functionalists, you get different theories of mind. But generally, they believe that the mind is an emergent property, just like water molecules emerge to create wetness. One molecule is not wetness. That's a water molecule, but 1,000 water molecules on your desk, now your desk is wet. That's an emergent property. So the argument then structure is consciousness and self-awareness are non-physical phenomena. Materialism cannot account for subjective experience, qualia. Therefore, consciousness implies a personal, immaterial source or God. Qualia is really important. So there's a famous thought experiment concerning like a color expert. So this gets into qualia is used as a way to undermine functionalism, right? And that things that your mind, the calculator can do 2 + 2 = 4. Your brain can do 2 + 2 = 4. Therefore, they're functionally equivalent. And it never accounts for like the subjective dimension of human experience, which is what postmodernism was really trying to recover, right? So as we moved forward in modernity, the subjective subject, my subjective experience becomes diminished in favor of like empirical, technological, scientific understandings of truth. The postmoderns go in the extreme then and say that there is no universal truth and you create your own truth. Well, that's not the case either. The pre-modern worldview of orthodoxy values subjective experience because your mystical encounter with God is only understood in your subjective relationship. Like it's an experience. It's not an objective thing you can just share with other people. It's subjective. Your faith is subjective. So we actually elevate the subjective subject within our pre-modern Orthodox view, but we don't then disregard the entirety of Christian metaphysics, rationality, mathematics, physics, all that. Of course not. So the thought experiment goes, imagine there's a color scientist. We'll say her name's Susie. And Susie knows everything like empirical facts about colors, their frequencies, their origins, how they're viewed by visible light. However, she's colorblind and she's never seen the color red. Therefore, if Susie then is able, she's no longer colorblind and able to see the color red, that is a veridical, meaning a truthful experience about color that cannot be encapsulated by just scientific understanding or empirical methods. And that is highlighting that consciousness is actually a unique feature of existence itself. It's not just the functional processes we do. It's actually the personal experiences we have that are also very important. And that has to do with this idea of qualia, that you can know everything about color, but if you can't see color, do you really know color? Do you really know the color red if you know every empirical fact about the color red, but you've never seen it? Of course not. Of course not. And that's what in a sense, the argument's going towards, is that consciousness and self-awareness are non-physical phenomena. Materialism cannot account for subjective experiences, qualia. Therefore, consciousness implies a personal immaterial source, i.e. the mind of God. And draws on from Descartes' dualism, idealism, and modern philosophy of mind debates, engages with neuroscience and philosophy of mind. That's one of the strengths. And it highlights the irreducibility of subjective experience. The objections is the emergentist or panpsychist accounts of consciousness. So they'll say, okay, yeah, Susie being able to see the color red's great and all, but her mind still doesn't actually exist. It's just an emergent process. So they could just not budge on that argument. Or God of the gaps objection, something like that. So number 8, the argument from beauty. The existence of beauty and aesthetic experience point towards a transcendent source of harmony and order. The structure of the argument goes, beauty evokes awe, wonder, and transcendence. Purely material explanations fail to account for the universality and depth of aesthetic experience. You see, we're moving now from the qualia, the argument from consciousness, into the argument of aesthetics, because it's building upon the subjective person, you see, and personal experience. Purely material explanations fail to account for the universality and depth of aesthetic experience. Aesthetics are objective, right? And the good, the true, and the beautiful, as Plato used to say, right? There is an objective good, there is an objective truth, and there is an objective beauty. And we all see this, and that's what sacred space is about. I'm not in favor of all the world religions in a ecumenist perspective, but the way they construct temples, and you can find these golden ratios or these sacred geometry or sacred ratios, pi, phi, Fibonacci, all these different things, creating sacred space, in that the human can feel it, right? That when you enter into a sacred space that's built on sacred geometry, there is something harmonious there that you can actually, that's tactile in a way. Therefore, beauty reflects the nature of a divine creator, because if materialism cannot account for beauty, and yet we know that beauty exists and there's an objective experience with it, where does beauty come from? And we would say beauty is an uncreated energy of God. Of course, God's energy is beautiful. Anything that God's energy interacts with makes it more beautiful. And so it's rooted in Platonic and Augustinian metaphysics, beauty as participation in the divine, and found in Orthodox theology as part of Logos theology, cosmos as icon of God, a la St. Maximus the Confessor, the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ. That's where I was pulling that from. Strengths that it integrates intellect and emotion, resonates with art, music, and nature. I could add poetry there as well. Again, these are things that are unique to the human species, right? For Yuval Noah Harari or anybody, who wants to argue that we're essentially animals, well, tell me then why things like music, self-sacrifice and war, life, romantic love, art, poetry, music, why are these things then occurring within human society? Because across cultures, across groups, there's an objective reality to these things. And we would argue that beauty itself is another avenue or energy back to God. The objections, subjectivity of aesthetic judgments. Now, I would disagree that aesthetics are subjective. But you could imagine somebody with cattle piercings in their nose, blue hair, totally augmented their physical appearance through, tattoos or whatever. They sort of diminished the innate beauty of their body. And they could say, no, I love this aesthetic. Okay, yeah. So some people, for some reason, probably due to a disordered soul, prefer ugliness, right? And you can look at modern abstract art and abstract expressionism and abstract architecture that is popular now, and it's like it doesn't have the same aesthetic as we had back in the day. And I think that has to do with a spiritual lacking in our contemporary society. Anyway, another objection would be evolutionary accounts of aesthetic perception. Okay. But then you can make the argument, the counter argument, that if evolution is selecting aesthetic perception, then that means it's somehow beneficial to survival, right? But anyways, that is using their own internal critique. Number 9, the argument from desire, the existential argument. Core claim here: human beings have an innate longing for ultimate fulfillment that only God can satisfy. Structure of the argument: every natural human desire corresponds to real object: hunger, food; thirst, and water. Humans desire perfect goodness, beauty, and immortality. Therefore, there must exist something that fulfills this, i.e., God. Right. So this is an interesting argument that I included in my top 10. I don't hear it as often, but I think it's a good argument that people can understand, right? It's another intuitive argument, just like the fine tuning argument. And so Augustine's "our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." C.S. Lewis mentioned this in Mere Christianity, The Weight of Glory. The strength is that it's experiential and existentially powerful. It integrates psychology, anthropology, and theology. And that's why I think it is a strong argument, because it's not even relegated to like Christian society per se. You can say, well, why is it that all, the religious phenomenon itself, meaning these sort of transcendent mythologies all around the world, why are humans creating these things? Again, even from an evolutionary perspective, if everything is, if human desire is always oriented to real concrete items and things that are necessary for survival, well, what is the evolutionary mechanism for God? Now, some people say it benefit, the mythology contains symbols, and these things then are beneficial for survival, one thing or another. But I think it leads to, well, why is it that the human heart, the human mind, and I would argue really the human soul, which encapsulates both of those, why is the human soul yearning for divinity, goodness, beauty, and immortality? Probably because those things actually do exist. The objections: desires do not necessarily entail satisfaction. That's wishful thinking. And that's not a bad response to that argument. Naturalistic explanations, evolutionary drives. Okay. And I think in a response, you could certainly play with, just like the other argument, you could play with the evolutionary dimension to it, and sort of rebut within their own paradigm. Number 10, our last argument for the existence of God. These are general arguments for the existence of God. The argument from religious experience. So we got another subjective argument here. The widespread and transformative experience of the divine across history is best explained by the reality of God. Structure: millions have experienced God or the transcendent. The best explanation for genuine transformative experience is that they correspond to reality. Therefore, God exists. You see, the structure there is basically saying, why is it that people across history have had similar mystical encounters or religious experiences? Now, I would argue, again, as an Orthodox Christian, that some people had mystical spiritual encounters that were probably demonic. I was very much formerly interested in Eastern mysticism. You start looking in tantric traditions in Southern India. I, as now, would say, yeah, that stuff's absolutely demonic. Look at what they're doing in some of those tantric rituals. But within, let's just use orthodoxy, the fact that we have a 2,000-year history of people experiencing God, and there's a continuity of revelation across those people, that would insinuate that there is something there. And so the philosophical background, it's phenomenological and empirical approach, William James, Rudolph Otto. So this is actually leading into a stream we're going to do in the future in regards to the religious like an academic overview of the phenomenon of world religion itself, and getting into definitions of religions that were really getting popular at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. But for William James, the famous American pragmatist, he has a famous definition, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not quoting verbatim, but essentially that religion is man's mystical encounter with something higher. And he got this experience from actually taking nitrous oxide, which was very common in the early 20th century, as a sort of inebriant. And so he got high on nitrous oxide and had what he believed to be an incredible mystical encounter. And so he said, whatever that encounter I had with that is God. And this is then the basis. This is the definition of the religious phenomenon. It's a personal, mystical encounter with this transcendent entity. That was, and Rudolf Otto, he kind of goes in that same general direction, a phenomenological approach. And so Orthodox mysticism, hesychasm, theosis, treats divine experience as direct knowledge, gnosis. Strength of this argument, it's universal and deeply personal. It explains moral and spiritual transformation, objection, subjectivity, and diversity of experiences, psychological and neurological explanation. So is it the strongest explanation? No, but in conjunction with all 10 arguments, I think it certainly has a place and a significance. So that concludes our 10 arguments for the existence of God.